Why does Australia have asylum seekers from South Sudan? I made this simplified explanation to help my own kids understand what really is a crazy, complicated issue. So here goes. As modern religion spread through Africa, the north of the continent became mostly Islamic and the south mostly Christian. Sudan sat half and half in both these districts. Back then, the country was run jointly by Egypt and England until Sudan achieved self-government in 1956. However, that new president was a Muslim, and the new government wanted to implement a particularly strict fundamental form of Islam throughout all of Sudan, with Sharia law practices such as genital mutilation. 8 million South Sudanese who were not Muslims stood up and said, "No, we don't want to live under Sharia law. We're not wearing hijabs, and we're not really that fond of the idea of genital mutilation." So the mostly Christian South went to war with the Islamic North, and that became the longest-running civil war that Africa has ever seen. Finally, after almost half a century of fighting, South Sudan achieved independence from the North in 2011. Yay, we beat the Muslims, now we can have some peace, right? Right? They were free of the Islamic North, but there was no peace for the people of South Sudan, and that was for several reasons. Firstly, this country had been at war for decades, and that was all many of the people had known their entire lives. Children had been raised in a war zone by parents who'd been raised in a war zone by parents, etc., etc. Generations of kids missed out on school and only knew war. And there was an insane amount of weapons freely available throughout the country. I'll get to that later about who supplied those. On top of all that fighting, there was a famine. The country couldn't grow enough food. Farmers had left their land to either flee or fight, and those who stayed got looted or murdered. And if that wasn't enough, there was a devastating drought. People in Sudan are still starving to death today in 2018 on this abundant planet where other countries struggle with obesity and throw out tons of perfectly edible food every day. People in Sudan still lose their lives for want of something to eat. It's just a shame you can't eat guns. Meanwhile, South Sudan was trying to stand on its own 2 feet as a brand new country. A country made up of all sorts of ethnic groups with deep ancestral rivalries. And remember, a shit ton of really deadly weapons. To understand the situation, imagine the states of Australia all spoke different languages and had different cultural beliefs. Then imagine that the President of South Sudan is a Queenslander and the Vice President is from New South Wales. And both those states have a really strong rivalry, only with guns. So the Sudanese President thought that the Vice President was planning a coup. So he sacked him. And the Vice President was like, "What?" He went back to New South Wales and he rounded up all his supporters. And they went biffed on with the Queensland supporters, only with guns. Queensland sent out government troops because they had the presidential power, and these troops picked on anyone who didn't speak Queenslander. The Victorians were like, "Hold my beer, mate," and they joined in the battle against the Maroons. And then while the states were fighting, there were splinter groups within the states with long-term rivalries, and they decided to ramp up their biff. In Sudan, this is how it happened, only with stacks of guns. So where did they get all those weapons from? Well, what's the second most common thing human beings kill themselves about, apart from their imaginary friends? Oil. And South Sudan had stacks of it. 98% of their wealth comes from oil. So why didn't the government sell some of that and buy food for their starving people? Politics. When the new borders were drawn up, 70% of all the region's oil reserves were in South Sudan, but all the oil pipelines are in the north, and the countries who chipped in to build those oil pipelines supplied weapons for the conflict because they wanted the oil to flow through to the ports. The enemies of those countries supplied weapons in the hope that they could get their hands on the oil, And as well, sneaky neighbouring countries took advantage of the unrest, sending their own mob to try to get control of the oil fields via the back door. And all of them had guns. People in South Sudan found it difficult to get on with their lives. Unis and industries closed down. People lost track of their friends and neighbours. Children were taken as slaves or child soldiers or left orphaned. Schools closed down because they were commandeered to use for military buildings. And all the while the government were killing off anyone who didn't speak the same language as the president. People fled from the relentless violence, millions of them, and the majority of those who fled were women and children. So asylum seekers poured into neighbouring countries in the region. There are right now an estimated 7 million hungry and homeless people battling overcrowding, risk of disease and other dangers in squalid refugee camps while they wait to be resettled or for the violence to end so they can go home. So Australia took in around 24,000 South Sudanese asylum seekers. They didn't come by boat, they were processed through refugee camps and assessed as genuine refugees. 42% of those that we accepted into our country came with uni degrees or other skills. Victoria welcomed 36% of our South Sudanese refugee intake. Of course, after what they survived, we're going to need to be a little bit patient while people settle into our society. But working together with community leaders, law enforcement, and trauma recovery experts, these people who have endured violence and hardship that many of us, thankfully, will never know, they can enjoy meaningful lives like the many other refugees that we've welcomed here in our multicultural community. And that, kids, is how we came to have Sudanese refugees here in Australia.